Hello and welcome to one of my favorite topics for class. So we're still within the world of moral development, only now we're looking at teaching tips. So how can we take what we've learned when it comes to Kohlberg stages and the development of morals, how can we apply this to the classroom? So, promoting moral development in the classroom. Because as teachers, not only do we want our students to learn our curriculum, but we also want to help them become better people. How can we do that? The first thing I want to do is take a look at, and let me get my laser pointer, under the heading of moral education. What are some approaches that schools use to do this? And we're going to look at 4 of them. The first one is called hidden curriculum. So what do I mean by hidden curriculum? This was spearheaded by John Dewey in the early 1900s. He's a very famous American educator. So Dewey felt like not only do we have this moral imperative to teach our curriculum, but we also have a moral imperative to teach our students to become moral human beings. And he said that the way that we do this is through the structure of the school, that the school itself and the way it is set up can help to promote moral standards in our students. So we do this through having school policies, classroom rules, by having teachers and staff who are moral and upright citizens, and through the choice of our text materials. So he says by doing things like teaching our students to raise their hand and wait to be called on, to not speak while others are speaking, to be respectful, to work with others, to turn in things when they're due, to, show up to class on time, that the basic structure of school helps to teach us some basic moral behaviors. Okay, that's the hidden curriculum. Another way of doing it is called character education. Now this one you might be more familiar with. This has become pretty popular in the last 10, 20 years. It is actually mandated by about 40 states right now. So, like I said, pretty common. What is character education? Okay, so this is actual direct instruction about character. So previously, hidden instruction is just saying the way the school is structured will kind of indirectly teach you these things. Character education is direct instruction, so where you actually sit down and you talk with students about things like, okay, what makes a great leader? What does it mean to be honest? Let's talk about responsibility. It does also include having a very explicit moral code, whether this is a school-wide policy or you simply make sure that your teachers have this, stating what students can and can't do, and also having sanctions for violations. So if they break that moral code, if they are disrespectful to one another, if they are hurtful or harmful, that there is an actual punishment involved. And what you're going to see with character education is you're going to be focusing on a variety of aspects of character. The typical approach is to choose one a month. You have different activities where you teach them about that trait, and usually at the end of the month you highlight a student or two that has really demonstrated those traits to their teachers. Here's some examples. So within Ohio, these two relate to Ohio, so schools of character. Character.org can provide this label to schools who are doing a good job with character ed, and Ohio works with schools of character. Torch is a program being done in Ohio to highlight teachers who are doing a good job with character ed. Here you can see an example of rewards that can be given to students who are working well within character ed, and you can see the kinds of posters and things. But again, it's direct instruction, saying what does it mean to be adventurous, what does it mean to be optimistic, and so on. Now, number 3, cognitive moral education. This one is usually restricted to your older students, maybe middle schoolers, but primarily your high schoolers. And this is where you get your high schoolers together and you actually discuss moral issues. Now, rather than getting together and saying, okay, let's talk about justice today, or what does it mean to be honest? What you have them do is delve into moral dilemmas and issues. So you might be able to pull these from contemporary issues in the news, Or you might, pull out some tried and true issues within the world of moral reasoning. So what you teach them to do is to really study what the moral dilemma is, identify both sides, and be able to discuss or even debate the issue. Debate clubs are very good at doing this as well. And the purpose of cognitive moral education is to get your students to advance their moral reasoning. So not only does it help them to articulate their position, but also help push them along through, shall we say, Kohlberg stages to advance in terms of how they think about moral issues. The fourth one, I have to say I am a bit biased. The fourth one is my favorite. Teaching morality using fairy tales and stories. So with this approach, rather than directly saying, today we're going to talk about honesty, or pulling things from the news, you look back. And you look back on stories and you look back on fairy tales, because in all of these old classic literature and classic fairy tales, there are embedded moral lessons. And so through teaching the story, through this imaginative world, you can get your students to see the moral issues and then to talk about them afterwards. So here we've got two different books. So William Bennett does a great series of books looking at the Book of Virtues. I have a whole collection of them on my shelf. In fact, I just looked over at my shelf and grabbed a few. I have the Children's Book of Virtues. I have the Children's Book of Heroes, all by William Bennett. I also have this one down here. In this one, what he does is he outlines great moral stories for each grade level and how you can use them. Over here we have Tending the Heart of Virtue. That's also a very good book that's fairly similar to this one. And then here, obviously, we just have an example of Grimm's fairy tales, because pretty much the majority of those early Grimm's fairy tales have great connections to moral lessons. All right, so let's continue. Here's some great quotes. So if you're interested, feel free to hit pause and take a look at these. But they both talk about how not only can you immerse yourself into the world of fairy tales, but how they make the moral lessons living, breathing things. All right, so what else do we do? You can also, it doesn't just have to be fairy tales. There are other kinds of stories out there. Stories when it comes to historical heroes, scientific heroes, role models. So I've got, I got a picture of it here. So my Book of Heroes. I also have been using the Book of Saints to go along with the Catholic education that I provide in my homeschool. Because it's February when I'm taping this, it's currently Black History Month. So we've been covering famous heroes such as Rosa Parks. This is a great series, Great Black Heroes. These are 5 notable inventors. We've been using that in our science class. And then along with history, we're currently in early American history. I have plans to cover Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, Paul Revere. And with each of these stories, you obviously can not only connect it to your history or your science curriculum, but then relate it to the moral virtue that is demonstrated by the individual. Okay, so teaching tips. So how's this different from what I just covered? So previously I was looking at 4 ways that this is done within curriculum on a larger scale. These are little things you can do in your classroom. I want to start with the question of, what advice do you have? What are some things you think teachers could do? Now, usually in class, this could be where we would share, but for now, keep those ideas in your mind and compare it to what I've come up with. So my list is not necessarily from the textbook. I felt that the textbook didn't have enough information here, so I pulled from a variety of sources. So starting with a really important note, direct lecturing about morals doesn't really work. Imposing firm control over the behavior of your students to create moral behavior doesn't really work, at least based upon research findings. It is not really an effective way to promote morals that are going to be transferred beyond the realm of the 4 walls of your classroom. So this means the hidden curriculum works partially. Character ed partially, but those aren't necessarily the best ways of doing it. So you don't want to just sit down and harp and tell someone this is why you need to be responsible. That doesn't often embed it or make it meaningful. All right, but what are some things you can do? Modeling. Be a good example for your students. I mean, think about how you are presenting yourself to your students. Because what you're wanting to see in them, you should demonstrate it yourself. So think of these two examples down here. So the way Cameron Diaz presented herself in Bad Teacher versus Robin Williams in Dead Poet Society. Two very different teachers. And think about then how that was then passed on to their students. How their behavior, students observe and imitate, and you want to present the things you want to see in your students. So that also relates to little things like you shouldn't be breaking school rules if you don't want your students to. You should put your phone away. If you're a science teacher, you should wear the same safety equipment you want your students to wear. When it comes to modeling, you're not the only model. Consider bringing in guest speakers. Think about other ways you can have different role models in your class. A great thing you can do is also look at the older students in your school. My daughter used to attend a school that was from pre-K to 12, and they would take the upper students and bring them into the lower classrooms and have them read to the kids and work with the kids and serve as models, and that was a great experience. So here's some examples when it comes to guest speakers. These are both from a school that my daughter had attended. So here the older students were able to hear from Marcus Luttrell talking about courage on the battlefield. And then they had Jason Jones come in. He talked about not only the call to adventure, but also his work with the Sudanese people in Darfur. He was working with the movie Hacksaw Ridge. So, I mean, think about the speakers you can bring in and the messages that they can convey to your students. Number 2, use activities, use games and role plays, things to give students, active participation to try to reinforce what you're teaching them about morals. So don't just have it be lessons. Here's some examples. So here, this is a pre-K class. They had read the book, Keep the Lights Burning, Abby. This was a true story. I actually have it in my homeschool curriculum as well. And so then after reading the book, they followed it up with some hands-on activities to reinforce the book. Here we have some great art activities that were done on fairness. Here's another one from Columbus City Schools. So the art teacher actually incorporated both history and morals by bringing in the speech of Martin Luther King Jr. and having it serve as inspiration for art projects. When it comes to games, I actually have a whole book on different games and activities you can do. This one's about teaching temperance. Temperance is one of the 4 cardinal virtues. And it's something that, well, to be honest, Americans are pretty bad with. So this is called the too much game. So you talk about how too much can be worse than too little. And you say things like too much, and the students fill in the blank with something you wouldn't want too much of, like too much food, too much screen time, too much video games, too much sugar. And then you talk about what might happen. What are the consequences of too much? And here are just some fun bulletin boards with activities related to virtues. All right, what else can you do? Embed it into your curriculum. So this relates to one of those curricular models I was talking about earlier. So the use of fictional stories. So yes, that is a curricular model, but it's also something small that you can bring into any individual classroom. So use fictional stories to try to convey a moral meaning. The Boy Who Cried Wolf, great example in terms of its lesson on the importance of honesty. I love this quote here. A story is a way to say something that can't be said any other way. You tell a story because a statement would be inadequate. If we go backwards for a second, yes, you can tell someone you shouldn't lie because if you lie, no one will know when to believe you. Or you can read them The Boy Who Cried Wolf. And that says things, it says that in such a deeper way and puts students into that story and makes it more meaningful. Here's another example of why fiction can be helpful. So I was talking with a principal once about a young boy who kept getting sent to the principal's office for bad behavior. And he said, you know what? He comes in and I keep having these conversations with him about our virtues and what we expect in terms of behavior, and nothing helps. Nothing makes a difference. So he said, all right, I decided to change things up. And I said, aren't you reading about the Chronicles of Narnia in class? And the boy brightened up and said, yes, we are. And the principal said, well, you know what? Lately, you have been acting like Edmund. And the boy's face just dropped and he said, I have? I've been acting like Edmund? And the principal said, yes, wouldn't you rather behave like Peter? Wouldn't you rather people saw you as Peter? And that led to a deeper discussion and an actual change in the student's behavior. So, here's some other examples of different pieces of literature that you can use for this type of model. There are also, like I said, great books out there that will help you connect pieces of literature to different moral stories. Here's something I wanted to show you. This is actually from an Excel spreadsheet that I use for homeschool right now for my daughter who's in 2nd grade. And you can see over here in this column, I've written all the various virtues that we plan on focusing on. Here are, oh, you waving hi? Here are the list of books where I can find where these stories are, and here are some of the stories. Now, granted, this is just a short snippet of my Excel spreadsheet, but you can see how there are so many different stories that you can connect to different virtues. So adding to what we have here in terms of embedding it into the curriculum, reading the story alone is not sufficient. You will see as we move on in Piaget stages that younger children aren't able to make that sort of a figurative connection easily. So it needs to be followed up with discussion and activities. You need to really reinforce what the moral is to help your younger students to comprehend it. Here are some examples. So here we have a pre-K class, finished reading St. George and the Dragon just in time for Appreciate a Dragon Day, and they talked about its relation to chivalry and justice and so on. Here we have another class. This is a kindergarten class. They had finished reading The Bell of Atri, and they were having a discussion about justice afterwards. And this is also from the same school. They posted this on their Facebook site, where they had read The Jungle Book and connected it to the virtue of courage. And here are some excerpts from different homework assignments from the students related to this, showing how they were making that connection to the moral. And also, you know, gosh, between Google and Pinterest, there are so many different ways you can find connections to and, you know, find sources if you'd like to do this type of curriculum. Now, I said embed it into the curriculum. I've only been talking about fictional stories. There's also, obviously, very important non-fictional stories as well. I mentioned these previously when you're looking at historical role models. Just look throughout your history books, and you can do this in science as well. And then finally, you also want to engage students in discussions of moral issues that are connected to their academic subject matter. So, for instance, in science class, you could discuss the moral implications of stem cell research. You could look at issues related to global warming. You know, you can also, like I said, connect this to your subject. So here's an example. This is actually from my sister-in-law, and I love this. So she was talking about how they were discussing the meaning of the word mediocrity in class, and she teaches 3rd grade, and she said one of her students said, really, if you think about it, mediocrity is just a loophole to get out of being something great. And I thought that was really cute. So there she is in a, whether it was a spelling or a vocabulary lesson, I'm not sure, but still being able to bridge from your English language arts to issues of moral or character. All right, what else can you do? You want to make sure that you praise moral behavior in your students with reinforcement. Let them know when they did a good job. Let them know when they made a good choice. You know, all of our work on operant conditioning says when you reinforce something, it's more likely to occur. So if you want to see more moral behavior in your students, praise them when they do it. A lot of schools do this with different certificates or student of the month, or, you know, there are a lot of creative ways you can go about doing this. Here's one in Pickerington where they have VIP, very impressive person, and once a month they have a party for these students. Here is my daughter's school from last year, St. Mary's Catholic School. So they have Student of the Month, and they post them on Facebook. Number 5, showing the opposite of a virtue. All right, now this one's kind of interesting. So rather than showing an example of where someone's really demonstrating perfectly that moral virtue, here they're doing the opposite. So things like too much junk food, too much TV, lying too much, like the boy who cried wolf, the very greedy bee. Now, these work best with slightly older students or students who are able to, really wrestle with and think about the fact that you're showing a bad example rather than a good example. But I want to show you some research that I just ran across. It's quite interesting. The video is not the most exciting in the world, but the message is quite good. So,
joining me now is Dr. Lee, a professor of human development and applied psychology at the University of Toronto.
We were wondering whether or not the classic stories such as Pinocchio, such as The Boy Who Cried Wolf, or the George Washington stories would have any beneficial effect to promote children to be honest. So what we did was that we set kids up so that they would be asked to play a guessing game, and we would place some of the toys behind them, and by playing the sound that are associated with the toys, they would guess the identity of the toys. The first couple of toys would be easy to do, such as a dog that barks or a cat that meows. But when it came to the third toy, that's a Barney, that we use a different kind of music that has nothing to do with Barney. And then we ask kids not to turn around to peek. And then we leave the room for 1 minute and to see whether or not kids would peek at the toy. And it turned out the majority of kids cannot resist temptation, and they would turn around to peek. And then when we come back, we cover up the toy. We would read them each of the 4 stories. One is the Pinocchio story. The other is the Boy Who Cried Wolf story. The third is the George Washington story. The 4th story is the important one, is the control story, is the tortoise and the hare story, which that has nothing to do with the promoting honesty, so we use that as control. And we want to find out whether or not after reading these moral stories to kids are more likely to tell the truth or telling a lie.
So what was it about George Washington and the apple tree that made kids more likely to tell the truth when they heard that story?
So we believe this is because the big difference between the 2 kinds of stories. One would be the Boy Who Cried Wolf or the Pinocchio story that kind of convey negative, punitive messages to the kids about if you lie, something negative will happen to you. On the other hand, the George Washington story promotes honesty by way of talking about the positivity of truth-telling. I think that is the real reason that why we actually see more kids telling the truth about their transgression after hearing the George Washington story. And to make sure that's the case, we actually changed the George Washington story to make it negative. In the new story, we basically said that George Washington actually chopped down the cherry tree and lied about that. But he was found out by his father, and his father was not happy and scolded him and took away his axe. And by just changing the ending of the story, the George Washington story no longer had the truth-promoting effect.
So I think that's a pretty interesting study. So it shows you might want to be careful with your stories that are showing the opposite of a virtue, because they may not necessarily have as powerful of an effect. And that perhaps using positive models is better. So we're getting close to the end. What else can we do? Get your students active with community service. So whether you want to use service learning, volunteering, philanthropy work, get them out there helping. And that time that they spend helping others can be quite beneficial in their own development. Here we have, again, this is Veritas Classical Academy in Marietta, where my daughter used to attend. At the end of every year, we'd have a big picnic. But the picnic wasn't just about having a picnic. We would spend the time, we always went to the same park, and we would clean up the park. I mean, we would trim the hedges, paint the buildings, repaint the lines on the basketball court, do all of their reading work for them as a way of saying thank you to our community. And then you can also have students, donate to charities and do all kinds of things. Here's some other examples from Columbus City Schools. So here they were having part of their science fair, they were going around and doing a community cleanup. And it's great to have them go out to their communities and help their communities. And here they were rewarding students for outstanding service. Number 7, you want to encourage your students to engage in what we call perspective taking. And what I mean by that is putting themselves in someone else's shoes. So what does it feel like to be that person? It gets them to see things from a different point of view. It helps to develop empathy. And this also can connect to pro-social behavior. So here's some examples. So this, again, this was a school my daughter attended. We would take the children out to local nursing homes and get them to connect with residents at the nursing homes and read stories with them and trick or treat there and have lunch there to help them develop empathy and pro-social skills. And there are a lot of great lessons out there you can connect to and find. Teachers Pay Teachers have a lot of great things that you can buy for not a whole lot of money. And there are also a lot of books out there that are also helpful. Number 8, in addition to punishment, you are going to have punishment. You are going to have students who are breaking your rules and misbehaving. But in addition to that punishment, especially when it's about some sort of immoral behavior or antisocial behavior, help those students, the misbehaving students, understand how they hurt other people, how they cause distress to either the classroom as a whole or to the victim, so that they can see how their behavior impacts another person. That is huge towards helping them with, again, kind of the previous note with perspective taking, but this being even more specific with how you handle your punishments. So, by activity, I'm referring to your homework. Most likely, along with this chapter, you have a homework assigned by me that is connected to creating an assignment within the realm of moral development or character ed. So do look at the specific instructions on Blackboard, but you're going to need to create some sort of an assignment or activity that a future class of yours could do. You need to determine what grade level, what is the topic you would want to teach them, and how would you teach it. So there are a lot of possible topics. I give you instructions on Blackboard about sites you can go to for more information and more details on what to do. But here's some examples of previous students' work. So what I want to see is pretty much in one page, either a handout, a lesson plan, sample student work, maybe a drawing of what a bulletin board might be, or a poster you would create, or some sort of a game. It's very, very open-ended. But I want to see some sort of an activity you could do with your students to teach them either a moral trait or a character. So here we have what makes a good citizen, teaching about caring through a bingo game, going over responsibilities that students have. For middle school, we have a connection between math and courage. I love whenever you can connect the subject matter to the trait. Responsibility by having classroom jobs, or connecting it to a history class by having students create their own Bill of Rights. And in high school, here we have talking about courage in connection to being a high schooler, citizenship for a government class, and then finally connecting it to world history through their review. And I love how for this 10th grade world history class, they were able to, so they start off with a great quote by Benjamin Franklin, but they're connecting it to World War II, which obviously is ripe for looking at moral dilemmas. All right, so again, do refer to Blackboard for the more details on this. But for now, that's it. Thank you so much for your attention and your participation. And if you stuck around until the very end of the video, I'm introducing you to Midge. This is my silliest cat. She just broke into my hair tie drawer and spilled hair ties all over my bedroom floor. Yes. So say hi, Midge. Again, bye. Thanks for hanging out with us. Oh, crazy cat.